The United States has long been the dream destination for countless members of the upper class seeking permanent residence abroad. However, America does not welcome all dreamers with open arms. They only select exceptional individuals with achievements and value to contribute. For this reason, countless people who don't meet the requirements are forced to seek risky alternative paths, from illegal immigration to other dangerous schemes. But the female protagonist in today's case chose a method beyond all imagination, dramatic, irrational, and even absurd to the point of disbelief. Her name was Zhang Xiaoning, born in 1997 into a merchant family in Handan, Hebei Province, China. Her parents had entered business early on, leaving their government jobs to start their own enterprise. Through relentless efforts and the advantages of their era, they accumulated considerable capital and lived comfortably. However, like many well-off families, they always yearned for better opportunities for their children. Xiaoning's parents hoped their daughter could explore the wider world beyond. They often confided that while they didn't speak English and would find it inconvenient to go abroad, their daughter was young and had the opportunity and means to reach out to the world and experience diverse cultures. These words deeply influenced Xiaoning from childhood, becoming the driving force behind her dream of studying overseas. However, the path to studying abroad was far from smooth for Xiaoning. Her academic performance was merely average, hardly outstanding. More concerning was her extremely unstable psychological state, with frequent episodes of emotional outbursts. In class, even mild criticism from teachers would immediately trigger her agitation. Once, when a math teacher reminded her to pay attention during class, Xiaoning immediately tore up her notebook and ran out of the classroom. This explosive reaction shocked and bewildered all the teachers. The teacher had tried to explain that he hoped students would develop independent thinking skills, but not through impulsive and uncontrolled behavior. However, Xiaoning completely rejected this advice, becoming even more tense and volatile. Years later, she would share these memories on social media, describing them as the turbulence of youth and harshly criticizing the Chinese education system for imposing psychological pressure on students, every word dripping with resentment and dissatisfaction. Faced with their daughter's continuous emotional outbursts, the family repeatedly contacted the school, requesting teachers adjust their educational methods appropriately. However, with hundreds of other students requiring attention, school administrators found it difficult to accommodate these special requests. Ultimately, Xiaoning's parents made a decision. If their daughter couldn't adapt to the domestic education environment, perhaps experiencing an international education system would bring positive changes. According to their plan, their daughter would complete her undergraduate degree in China to establish a solid academic foundation, then study in America. However, reality went against their expectations. Xiaoning's stubborn and difficult attitude left both the teaching staff and school leadership feeling helpless. Eventually, they decided to let things be, believing each person must take responsibility for their chosen path. The predictable result? In this atmosphere of absolute freedom, Xiaoning's academic performance plummeted disastrously. Simultaneously, her psychological condition deteriorated, showing signs of severe depression. She began self-isolating, spending entire days in her room without wanting to interact with anyone. Recognizing the alarming situation, her family wanted to take her to see a mental health professional. However, at the mere mention of psychiatric consultation, Xiaoning reacted violently, screaming that she was completely normal and threatening to call the police if forced. She then broke down crying and completely collapsed. With no other options, the family had to let her take a leave from school. The dream of studying abroad for university was essentially shattered. However, the Zhang family didn't give up hope. They believed that given their daughter's sensitive and extreme temperament, the only way out was an international environment, with America being the ideal choice. Perhaps a completely new environment would bring positive changes. Determined to make this dream reality, the Zhang family spared no resources, financial or relational, to pave the way for their daughter's overseas education. By 2021, when Xiaoning was 24, she finally received an acceptance letter from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, one of America's prestigious public universities located in Los Angeles. As a leading international university, UCLA maintains extremely strict admission standards for international students. Requirements include excellent academic performance, high scores on international standardized tests, and complete application materials including recommendation letters and personal essays. Particularly, without scholarship support, families must have strong financial capability to afford tuition costs reaching up to $60,000 annually. No small sum. Holding the acceptance letter with the department head seal and signature, Xiaoning couldn't hold back her tears. This was the light at the end of the tunnel she had waited for so long. In a social media post, she had emotionally shared that the first half of her life had endured too much coldness and discrimination, things that shouldn't exist in the 21st century, and that the journey to find happiness was always full of obstacles. To obtain this invaluable document, her family had sacrificed nearly all their assets and connections, transforming a girl who could barely graduate from domestic community college into a student at one of the world's renowned institutions. In August of that year, Xiaoning boarded the flight to Los Angeles with excitement and high hopes. As the plane gradually descended at Los Angeles International Airport, she gazed at the clear blue sky and white clouds through the airplane window, her heart filled with bright expectations for the future ahead. Throughout the journey, she continuously updated her social media status, enthusiastically sharing with friends about this new chapter in her life. However, she had no idea that what awaited her was not the paradise of freedom she dreamed of, but a series of bizarre and unexpected events that could completely change her destiny. From her first days in Los Angeles, Xiaoning fell in love with the city's mild and pleasant climate. Especially when she first tasted authentic American hamburgers, she couldn't help but marvel and affirm that genuine American hamburgers truly had the best flavor. During this period, she frequently shared thoughts about free living and joy on international social media platforms, proudly declaring that she had finally transformed from spiritually American to physically American. Nevertheless, she clearly understood that to truly realize this dream, she still needed tremendous effort. The first task she set for herself was breaking through cultural barriers and truly integrating into the local community. From her earliest days in Los Angeles, Xiaoning actively sought to connect and build relationships with American students. However, reality completely shattered her dreams. Her English abilities and communication skills were too limited to achieve the goals she had set. Conversations typically stopped at a few hollow social pleasantries before sinking into awkward silence. Even after several months, she still felt like an outsider, unable to truly integrate into the new environment. Typically, international students after graduation have two main choices: seeking employment opportunities to obtain work visas to stay in America, or returning home to develop their careers. However, with her poor academic performance, especially at a prestigious institution like UCLA, Xiaoning's transcript was truly unacceptable. With her current academic record and capabilities, finding a company willing to sponsor a work visa was nearly impossible, and even securing a regular internship position became a major challenge. After 6 months, Xiaoning's academic situation continued deteriorating. Not only did internship prospects become hopeless, but even graduating successfully became questionable. In these circumstances, despite her family's means back home, they couldn't cross the ocean to help her solve these difficulties. The path to legal immigration through employment was essentially closed. However, Xiaoning wasn't ready to give up. Through various channels, she learned about an escape route many others had tried, applying for political asylum. However, this path was completely unlike what she had imagined. Xiaoning only had an ordinary past as a female student who had never suffered injustice or oppression. This reality put her in an extremely awkward position. She couldn't legitimately apply for asylum, nor dared to recklessly fabricate stories, since her family remained in China and any extreme actions could endanger her relatives. Nevertheless, political asylum had essentially become the only remaining option. In this sensitive matter, the local American community could hardly provide substantial advice, forcing Xiaoning to seek support from the Chinese community. Soon, an advertisement on a North American Chinese forum caught her attention. Professional lawyer, immigration guidance, guaranteed success. This message appeared like a final ray of hope, prompting her to quickly contact the mentioned lawyer. This lawyer went by the English name Jim and Chinese name Li Jingjing, a Chinese-American legal professional. At their first meeting, Jim frankly assessed that her situation was not particularly promising. These words weighed heavily on Xiaoning's heart, but she still didn't want to give up. She expressed willingness to pay all necessary consultation fees, hoping only for the lawyer's guidance. After a period of contemplation, Jim finally responded. There might be a solution, but she would need to come to New York in person for detailed discussions, as these were matters that couldn't be handled over phone or email. Just a few days later, Xiaoning took a direct flight from Los Angeles to New York. Upon landing, she hurriedly transferred through multiple subway lines to reach Flushing, the densely populated Chinese neighborhood in Queens, eastern New York City. Setting foot in Flushing for the first time, Xiaoning had the strange feeling of being in some familiar hometown city. Throughout this bustling street, most faces were Asian, with Chinese signage and voices everywhere. Aromatic grilling stalls appeared along the roadside, creating a very familiar and intimate atmosphere. After walking through several crowded streets, she reached the building on 39th Avenue where Jim's law office was located. Stepping inside, she noticed most clients were Chinese Americans, some inquiring about illegal residency status issues, others asking about transferring assets from China to America, all creating a busy and bustling scene. After simple registration and a brief wait, Xiaoning was finally guided by an assistant to the private office at the back. Entering the room, Xiaoning saw Jim sitting formally behind his desk, wearing a proper suit and concentrating on reviewing documents. He had clearly studied her background materials beforehand. After a brief silence, he frankly announced that her situation was quite complex and difficult to resolve. Upon hearing these words, Xiaoning immediately pleaded earnestly, desperately hoping he could find a way to help her stay in America. Jim responded deliberately, "Methods aren't impossible, but would require active cooperation from your side." He explained that this so-called cooperation meant creating a public rights demonstration event. Specifically, Jim suggested Xiaoning should make a protest banner criticizing her home government, then take it to crowded locations like the White House, Times Square, or the United Nations headquarters for demonstrations. The goal was finding places with the heaviest foot traffic to attract public and media attention. Although this method seemed simple and crude, according to Jim, it had been tested many times with good results, even becoming a systematic operational process. However, after hearing this, Xiaoning felt extremely reluctant. She completely didn't believe she had ever endured any real unfair treatment. But in her current circumstances, she seemed to have no other choice. After many sleepless nights of consideration, she finally resolved to implement this plan. To execute this plan convincingly, she needed to construct a credible story. Xiaoning spent time thinking carefully, then picked up a pen to write 2 lines of Chinese characters on a sign, shaky and distorted. On the back, she wrote similar content in English. Not only that, she spent several sleepless nights fabricating a tragic story about being persecuted, preparing for any possible situations. After completing all preparations, Xiaoning carried the sign and took the subway toward eastern Manhattan to First Avenue with the United Nations headquarters as her target. On a morning in early February 2022, exactly as planned, Xiaoning appeared before the UN building. She held up the large sign, her face expressing pain and desperation, shouting loudly in both Chinese and English, "Give me back justice!" When passers-by stopped to observe, she worked to stimulate her emotions, crying while recounting the pre-prepared story. "I was once detained at a hospital in Changping District, Beijing, forced by doctors to receive injections, and even sexually assaulted by police who took advantage of the situation." To make the performance more realistic, she forced herself to shed tears. However, reality's coldness far exceeded all her expectations. Throughout the entire morning, virtually no one paid any significant attention. This was partly due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which had substantially reduced street foot traffic compared to normal times. Additionally, just days before, New York had experienced a tragic apartment fire killing 19 people, causing thousands of angry citizens to gather before City Hall protesting the local government's ineffective management. This event had captured all media attention. Furthermore, New Yorkers had become too accustomed to these types of sign-holding protests, while mainstream media remained completely indifferent. Only a few small local newspapers provided brief coverage, along with some websites casually capturing short videos, but none created any significant impact. Xiaoning immediately felt completely disappointed. After a morning of exhausting performance, not only did she fail to attract attention, but became a laughingstock for passers-by. Returning to her hotel, Xiaoning angrily threw the sign straight into the trash, then immediately called lawyer Jim to demand why his proposed plan had completely failed. Over the phone, Jim maintained a very calm tone, trying to reassure Xiaoning and explaining that such things couldn't succeed overnight. He emphasized the need for persistent expansion of influence, continuously creating waves of public opinion to ultimately achieve desired goals. Jim even advised Xiaoning to display more intense emotions and create more tragic images to increase the persuasiveness of her story. However, this time, Xiaoning didn't immediately follow Jim's advice, but decided to pause and observe the situation. Just days later, relatives back home contacted her through social media, harshly questioning why she was willing to become someone else's tool, performing actions that fabricated and distorted the truth. Faced with this unexpected wave of criticism, Xiaoning felt confused and didn't know how to respond. What surprised her even more was a call from her parents, demanding she immediately delete all related images and content while advising her not to continue being manipulated and exploited by others. Under her family's thorough analysis and earnest advice, Xiaoning decided to delete everything she had posted that very night. However, she soon discovered that Jim kept these images on his social media accounts, even actively sharing and spreading them across multiple platforms. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Xiaoning contacted Jim again, demanding he remove those images. However, Jim showed complete indifference, even criticizing that Xiaoning's actions would ultimately leave both sides unsatisfied. Faced with Jim's uncooperative and rigid attitude, Xiaoning completely lost her composure, expressing her emotions through angry shouting and even threatening the lawyer. However, as an experienced lawyer, Jim obviously couldn't be swayed by threats. He not only firmly refused all cooperation requests, but also clearly declared he would no longer represent her case. When negotiations reached a complete deadlock, Xiaoning tried to demand refund of the lawyer fees she had paid, but Jim rejected this outright. At this point, Xiaoning truly realized she had not only been exploited, but thoroughly deceived. Her entire rights struggle plan in America had become a complete farce from beginning to end, not only failing to attract public attention, but also putting her in an impossible position. Anger and humiliation intertwined, causing her to completely lose control. Thoughts of revenge began emerging, but she quickly recognized her limitations. No gun license, inability to purchase weapons, and even if she could, no experience using them. Although Jim was elderly, he was still a man and might have support around him. Reckless action would be like walking into a trap. Driven by anger and unwillingness to accept defeat, Xiaoning began secretly planning. After many sleepless nights of consideration, she devised what she thought was a feasible approach. The next day, she visited New York's famous pastry shop, Ferrara, to buy an elegant cake. Then, with an attitude of reconciliation and goodwill, she proactively contacted Jim, hoping to salvage their fractured relationship. In the phone call, she sincerely admitted having behaved disrespectfully on March 11th, while expressing readiness to follow all directions and continue implementing what was called rights protection actions. Initially, Jim seemed somewhat skeptical, but ultimately accepted her proposal, though simultaneously setting strict conditions. She couldn't have emotional outbursts anymore, must strictly comply with all arrangements, and must bear all additional costs. Faced with these requirements, Xiaoning agreed without any hesitation. With the appearance of this cake, the drama woven from lies and manipulation was ready to enter a new chapter full of surprises. On the morning of March 14, 2022, Xiaoning deliberately took a taxi to Flushing, carrying a carefully prepared cake box. She entered the law office during early morning hours when the entire office was empty, except for a security guard dozing on a bench near the entrance. Recognizing this as a favorable opportunity, she adjusted her mood and headed straight to the target's office, gently knocking on the door. Upon entering, she displayed a bright smile and placed the cake box on the desk, emphasizing, "This is cake from Flushing's most famous shop." However, Jim only glanced over indifferently, then continued focusing on the work at hand, clearly showing no interest in this gift. Xiaoning tactfully presented her opinion. "Since we've ended our cooperative relationship, you should refund my money." But Jim refused decisively. If everyone did like you, the legal profession couldn't exist. When the conversation reached a dead end, Xiaoning fell silent for a few seconds, then slowly reached toward the bottom of the cake box. Suddenly, she pulled out a gleaming, sharp knife. Witnessing this scene, Jim reflexively tried to use the documents in his hands as a shield, but an elderly man's reaction speed couldn't compare to a woman in her 20s. The sharp blade stabbed straight into his chest. Horrific screams of pain echoed throughout the room. Before the large desk, Jim collapsed from severe pain as blood quickly spread everywhere. All the anger and hatred accumulated in Xiaoning's heart exploded in this moment. She frantically wielded the knife continuously, each strike precisely targeting vital areas: throat, heart, abdomen, all fatal blows without any mercy or hesitation. The entire office was stained with blood. When Jim's assistant discovered the abnormality, the scene was already saturated with the metallic smell of blood, like a living hell. Flushing residents couldn't help but feel horrified and frightened. Someone immediately called police. Emergency teams quickly arrived and transported Jim to the nearest hospital, but due to excessive blood loss, he couldn't survive. New York police arrested Xiaoning immediately afterward, promptly charging her with second-degree murder and fourth-degree illegal weapon possession, then taking her to NYPD's 109th Precinct for interrogation. When the case officially entered judicial proceedings, throughout the 2-year trial process, Xiaoning gradually revealed a completely different side of herself. On June 8, 2023, she appeared at Queen's Supreme Court. Notably, that day she had written 2 prominent English words on her shirt: "No fire, no Reds," like a declaration opposing the entire American judicial system. However, this slogan carried deep ironic meaning, as she had once lived with firm belief that America was the beacon of freedom, but now was personally destroying the ideals she had once pursued. Throughout the trial proceedings, she displayed extremely unstable emotional states, nearly standing on the precipice of complete collapse. She continuously shouted to rebut court rulings, alleging the case lacked convincing evidence, even questioning the credibility of autopsy reports and demanding re-examination. However, when judges rejected these requests, she quickly changed tactics, attempting to use mental health issues as legal shield. She declared having schizophrenia and therefore couldn't bear criminal responsibility for murder. However, prosecutors quickly refuted this argument by pointing out that in her previous political asylum application, she had clearly affirmed her stable mental health and denied having any psychological disorders. This obvious contradiction between previous and subsequent statements caused her defense strategy to completely collapse. She couldn't provide reasonable explanation for why someone who never showed mental abnormalities while living in China suddenly developed serious mental illness after arriving in America. At trial, her testimony was riddled with contradictions and gaps, completely lacking persuasiveness. Throughout the proceedings, the victim's family and colleagues were present to express deep indignation at Xiaoning's brutal behavior. Lawyer Li's family shared their ultimate pain, particularly that the elderly mother still hadn't been told of her son's death, forcing the entire family to live in persistent, inconsolable grief. The legal community also voiced outrage, stating this case created fearful psychology in their profession. Many lawyers admitted that since the incident, they had become extremely cautious when meeting Chinese clients, even feeling anxious and uneasy. On September 20th, 2024, during an important trial session, Xiaoning's defense lawyer argued that his client was in a state severely affected by extreme emotions at the time of the crime. Essentially, this was an effort to transform the case from premeditated murder to crime of passion. However, prosecutors firmly rebutted, Someone who deliberately hid a knife in the bottom of a cake box. You want to tell me she had no intention to kill? Even if you wanted to cut cake, you wouldn't choose this type of tool. Moreover, as a young person with sufficient financial capability to pay overseas education expenses, she couldn't possibly not know that when buying cake, shops provide specialized plastic cutting utensils. The defendant clearly acted in a completely conscious state, with careful consideration and detailed planning, with premeditated intent to kill the lawyer. This was not behavior in a delusional state or severe loss of self-control. On October 2nd, 2024, the jury took only 4 hours to reach a unanimous verdict, completely rejecting all of Xiaoning's defenses and confirming her second-degree murder charge as valid. When announcing the sentence, the judge emphasized, "This is not merely an ordinary murder case. The injuries the victim endured were distinctly torture-like and abusive. This clearly was not impulsive behavior, but a conspiracy long contemplated and executed with planning. Each knife strike was extremely precise, aimed straight at the most vulnerable points, without any hesitation or mercy." Finally, the court issued its verdict. 27-year-old Xiaoning was found guilty of second-degree murder, sentenced to 25 years to life imprisonment, plus additional charges. After sentencing concluded, the judge told Xiaoning, "You will get your wish to stay in America, but not walking freely on the streets. You'll become a guest of our prison system." Here, the American dream that Xiaoning had pursued her entire life finally became reality, except it was a nightmare. And that concludes today's case. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.